Now it's time to take a look at Chapter 2, Part 2. We'll look at a few more diseases of the skin and eyes as we get into our first chapter of actual diseases in our microbiology exploration. So, herpes simplex viruses 1 and 2, those are the old traditional names, but they're still very much in use. The more recent sort of designation is human herpes virus 1 and 2 HHV 1 and 2. Anyway, human herpes virus or human simplex virus 1 is associated with cold sores or fever blisters, they're sometimes called. Not the canker sores you get inside your mouth, but the ones on the outside, on the lips or on the skin around the mouth, or even in the eyes. Um, um, It can be spread by physical contact. A lot of contact sports, people can transmit the disease among one another quite readily during those kinds of activities. Wrestling is famous for it, as well as for MRSA. You can get herpes on a lesion. If you have a skin lesion on the finger and it gets in there, you can get what's called herpetic whitlow. It's a lesion on the finger. Herpes can develop into encephalitis, which can be a fatal disease. Human herpes virus or human simplex virus 2 excuse me, is more associated with genital herpes, but there's not an absolute split. You can have an HSV2 infection in the nerves of the face that causes lesions in that area, and you can have HSV1 or 2 causing genital herpes, although usually, again, HSV2 causes genital herpes. The thing about these things is they exhibit latency, as we just saw previously with varicella. The virus can remain dormant in the dorsal root ganglion, in this case of, if we're talking about the HSV1, typically the trigeminal nerve, and then can reemerge, reactivate, and produce lesions on the face at any time. There you can see a little cartoon drawing of the trigeminal nerve and its branches, sensory nerve of the face and oral cavity, among other things, and it will allow those viruses to travel up those axons, retrograde motion to the, or transport to the nerve cell bodies in the ganglia, and stay there, and then maybe re-emerge at a later time. So HSV2 most typically would remain dormant or latent in the sacral ganglia down in the pelvic region, and again, HSV2 can cause encephalitis. It's a very, very dire situation indeed if that does happen, mainly in neonates or immunocompromised people. Treatment is with acyclovir. We just learned about that. We said that the thymidine kinase, the viral thymidine kinase, will take acyclovir and phosphorylate it, and then the viral DNA polymerase will incorporate it into the growing DNA chain that it's copying, and it will terminate the chain because no additional base could then be added after that acyclovir phosphate. Measles, Rubeola, morbillivirus causes measles and is transmitted by a respiratory route. A macular rash starts on the face and spreads to the rest of the body. Remember, macular rash is just flat red spots, quite dark red spots. Koplik spots are spots in the oral cavity, so there's a mucous membrane involved in here as well. That's kind of a special characteristic to identify measles compared to other viral disease with exanthems or endanthems. Conjunctivitis, inflammation of the conjunctiva, red eyes. It can lead to encephalitis. Pansclerosing or subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. Yeah, that. And that's a very bad situation. Luckily, it's very rare, but it's common enough. If you have all the children in a population getting the measles, which is what used to happen, then there's an unacceptable number of children that are dying or being very drastically damaged by this disease. So vaccine campaigns, and I've had a great deal of luck vaccinating against measles. Here's a little champ with measles. Here's what has happened to the incidence or the prevalence of measles. I guess this is a reported number of cases. And look what happens when the vaccines. Actually, the measles incidence started to drop a little bit before the vaccine started to get to be applied. But anyway, really the vaccines were the death knell for this disease. And you can see what happened over a period of time. We're down to, we've already looked at this graph previously. On this scale, it doesn't even register. In the last couple of decades, there are some cases remaining in the country, so we'd like to get rid of those as well if possible. Rubella is also called German measles. Is a different virus. It produces a similar looking rash, but it's a more mild disease. The bad thing about it is it can cause rubella syndrome, congenital rubella syndrome. If someone contracts this disease while they're pregnant, it can cause severe fetal damage or stillbirth. So that's obviously out. And so we have a vaccine campaign against measles. So measles, mumps, rubella is usually given as a combination of those 3 vaccines together, multiple doses, and get rid of that disease. 5th disease, kind of a fun history thing. There was a list that was sort of like a standard of practice in medicine in 1905 that listed skin rashes, and the 5th one on the list was just called 5th disease because it didn't actually have a name at that time. So erythema infectiosum is 5th disease, and it's caused by a parvovirus, which causes mild flu-like symptoms and a face rash. So that's just a common thing that children get, just so that you can be educated about it and your patients won't be shocked or appalled when they realize it's a fairly common thing. Roseola is caused by human herpes virus 6 or 7. Causes a high fever and rash on the trunk and neck, lasting for a couple of days. And so that's just something to mention. Here's another one, little study question. 4-year-old boy with a history of cough, conjunctivitis, and fever. Has a macular rash that started on the face and is spread to the rest of the body. What could cause this disease? If you look back, you probably remember even now we just talked about measles, and that represents the list of things we said were characteristic of a measles infection. How about this one? Vesicular and pustular rashes in an 8-year-old boy, lasting 5 days duration on his neck and stomach. Within 5 days, 73 students in the school got this disease. Very, very infectious, communicative, whatever you want to call it, and that's characteristic of chickenpox. There's a classic look of those pustular rash lesions. All right, so we come to some fungi. Dermatomycoses are superficial fungi or fungal infections of the skin. They have a nickname of tinnias or ringworm. Those are not specific names of individual diseases or pathogen-caused diseases. They're more generic than that. And tinea capitis, ringworm of the scalp, can occur in infants. Tinea cruris, ringworm of the groin, so-called jock itch. Tinea pedis, athlete's foot. And tinea unguium, you can get a pretty deep fungal infection in a nail, a fingernail or a toenail, typically a big toenail, and it might require some anti-mycotic treatment for that. Here's a picture of ringworm, some fungus lesions on the face. In this case, you can see some athlete's foot, and many people have experienced a little bit of athlete's foot, at least. Not a bad thing to do, to put a little bit of medicated foot powder on your feet on a daily basis. You tend to be a person that sweats a fair amount, and you can avoid that problem. Cutaneous mycoses. So what kind of organisms cause these things? And here are 3 things you should know that cause these dermatomycoses. Dermatophytes, they're called. Trichophyton, epidermophyton, and microsporum. They infect the skin, nails, and hair, and cause these superficial infections. They can eat keratin, basically, and subsist on that. Excuse me. Treatment is with miconazole or itraconazole or terbinafine. And so you can, some of these you've probably heard of miconazole. If you get we'll talk about vaginitis in just a minute. That's another thing that might be used to treat, miconazole might be used to treat that. Um, all right, subcutaneous mycoses. Some fungal infections, especially in tropical climates, can, if there's a break in the skin, they can get in there, they can cause deep and constantly growing and worsening fungal infections of typically of the feet. You walk around and you get a little nick on the foot, and then you have all this fungus on the ground, and you get it into your foot. And most terrible and nasty things indeed. Sporothrix. Sporothrix shanki is something else I should have reserved that discussion for when we got down to the bottom. This is called rose gardener's disease. It's associated with hay, moldy hay, or rose bushes. And if you're a rose gardener, if you have a big rose garden, you might, or you know someone that does, you might find that they've experienced infection with sporotrichosis, or sporothrix, I should say, and had sporotrichosis. It'll cause a fungal infection of the skin where those puncture wounds were. Chromoblastomycoses are those bad ones I was talking about that can get into your feet when you live in a tropical climate or visit in a tropical climate, and they just start growing in your body. Believe me, that's a relatively benign looking one. I tried to pick one that wasn't quite so shocking. There's some pretty amazing pictures of these. If you do find it interesting, you can search that. The thing to do is to treat this early on. Once you get a really well-established infection, it doesn't seem to respond to the antimycotic drugs anymore. So the key is wear shoes. If you go visit somewhere in a more tropical climate, do not go barefoot, even though it's tempting because it's so nice and warm. Bad idea. Not to mention the other parasites that we know that might penetrate through your plantar surface. Candida albicans, a very, very common yeast. It's on everyone's body, essentially, in probably everyone's oral cavity and nasal cavity to some degree, and it's kept at bay by the other organisms that grow there, so it's not really a problem. It's not even considered technically a pathogen. It just isn't. It's only pathogenic as a opportunistic infection. It can cause thrush in someone who's immunocompromised, maybe someone who has an alcohol abuse problem or some other thing that's happening, some disease, maybe they're taking a medication that's knocking their immune system back, whatever. They might get an overgrowth of yeast in their oral cavity. That's called thrush. Very much more common is getting a yeast infection when there's an imbalance of microbes in the vagina. Vaginitis is an inflammation in the vagina caused by usually Candida. And so treatment with miconazole or nystatin, very common drugs used to knock those yeast back, get them back in balance. Immunosuppressed individuals can get very severe candida infections. Now that's when you really get into trouble, and that's when it looks like a pathogen, acts like a pathogen. So it can cause very severe disease in people with immunosuppressants. So fluconazole, a more aggressive antimycotic, can be used to try to get that under control. It can grow right in your brain, for example. Or you can see some picture of some yeast that have been grown in the laboratory, and you can see that they have pseudohypha, and they have spores that are forming blastoconidia and chlamydoconidia forming in the hypha. Here's a picture of oral candidiasis thrush. Parasitic infections of the skin. The title could have stayed right on there for the next slide. It wouldn't have been a bad idea. Scabies, it's body lice. They're a type of little arthropod that can colonize the skin. It digs tunnels in the skin and lays eggs in there, which causes a tremendous amount of discomfort, inflammation, and itchiness. It's very irritating substances that are secreted in there as they're creating their little nests. And there's some mites. I should have said lice. I should have said mites. So these mites are in there. You can see them crawling out of their little burrows. They formed in the skin. And well, maybe I had put in a picture of a little diagram of a mite tunnel in the skin, but I guess not. So topical insecticides, and they're quite nasty insecticides that are used to treat these on the skin. Lindane, which is an insecticide that was used out of doors many, many years ago, but it's been illegal for a long, long time because it's a very, very harsh chemical, kills just about anything. But that's not the only one that's used. There are some that are a little less egregious, but still pretty harsh stuff to kill these things. Lice, pediculosis is an infestation with lice. There's Pediculus humanus capitis, the head lice, and it's very common for children to come home from school with head lice from nice families. If someone in the school, their kid gets lice, it's very, very easily spread among children. They are very free to touch each other and handle each other's possessions and so forth. And once one egg gets on someone's body, then it can start up or a couple start up an infestation. The lice lay eggs and attach them to the hair shafts. And eventually, they hatch out, and it's kind of hard to get rid of it because a lot of the treatments you can use can kill all the living, moving, motile animals, but the eggs are protected, and then another batch will hatch out. So again, treatment with those same topical insecticides. I didn't list them out, but here's a nit, it's called. A louse egg attached to a hair. And there's the little guy inside there, and here's a little louse. They can move amazingly quickly along a hair shaft. If you start going in there trying to find them, they can scuttle away. But you can find you usually won't see them very easily, but you can see that you can find the nits because they're anchored to the hair shafts, and that's a giveaway. The infestation is there. So here's a lice infestation story. There's a picture of the little. Actually, I think this is mites, and so the scabies are tunneling in the skin, causing these red little passages where the tunneling has happened and the irritation has arisen up, and scabies infestation. Okay, how about some bacterial diseases of the eye? Conjunctivitis is typically caused by Haemophilus influenza. When it comes to bacteria, there are some viral infections. We just talked about measles can cause conjunctivitis, but in this case, we're talking about bacteria. Haemophilus influenza. Moraxella is another one that can cause conjunctivitis. Acanthamoeba, we talked about that already. Dirty contact lens solutions that weren't sterile, home prep solutions, bad idea. You can wind up with amoeba in the eye that can infect the cornea. Ophthalmia neonatorum, it's what it's called when an infant at birth or a baby at birth contracts gonorrhea in the birth canal in their eyes. And that can cause blindness. And so babies, when they're born, are automatically, in this country, typically treated with antibiotics, just a couple drops right in the eyes at the time of birth, so that there's no chance of an infection going forward. Chlamydia trachomatis. It's a very, very prevalent pathogen. If it gets in the eyes, it can cause inclusion conjunctivitis or chlamydial conjunctivitis. Again, this can be transmitted during childbirth also. It can be spread through swimming pool water, treated with tetracycline. So got to make sure that those eyes are checked and treated after birth if there's even the slightest chance. There's scarring that forms, inflammation and scarring that forms on the surface of the eyelids, and then those start scratching the cornea, and they keep scratching the cornea, and eventually it gets scarred and it's no longer transparent. And eventually all the eyelashes turn inward, and they begin to scratch the cornea as well, and it turns out it ruins the transparency of the cornea and causes blindness. Surprised I didn't write it on there. It's the leading cause of infectious blindness in the world. It's common and bad. Keratitis can be caused by fungi. Can be caused by herpes simplex We talked about herpes simplex already, or HHV1. We said that it can lay dormant in the trigeminal nerve, but it can also, instead of causing cold sores, it can actually go to the eye, cause eye infection. So that can cause damage to the eye and blindness. So if someone starts developing this, is quickly and aggressively treated with trifluridine to try to save the eye. Acanthamoeba, we talked about that before also. Amoeba that can get into your I got a little redundancy here, get into your contact lens fluid and cause infection in your eye with amoeba. Kind of a gross thing to think about, right? Okay, well, that's our chapter for chapter 21, our first chapter of diseases, and we'll pick right up with chapter 22 for our next installment. All the rest of our chapters that we're doing are going to be diseases by body system. So I look forward to seeing you next time.